Hello and welcome to the Arabic Hour. My name is Khinwa Hakim. On today's program, our guest is returning from a previous week, Jeff Klein, a local anti-war pro-Palestine peace activist. On today's program, he will be discussing issues of Palestine after a recent return from a visit to the Middle East, where he visited Lebanon, Syria, and Palestine.
Except that right now, from the point of view of my recent visit, I would say things are at a kind of low ebb, and everyone is pretty pessimistic. But nobody, I mean, this is the other thing, as you know, that Palestinians are, as bad as things are at the moment, there are no voices for surrender.
Jeff Klein is a retired machinist and local union president active with the anti-war group Dorchester People for Peace and several Palestine solidarity organizations. He is a board member of Massachusetts Peace Action and a leader of its Palestine-Israel Working Group. He is also the statewide coordinator of the New Day initiative to change U.S. policy on Israel Palestine, which focuses on our elected officials. Since 2004, Jeff has traveled almost every year to Palestine-Israel and elsewhere in the Middle East, including Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and Egypt, most recently including Syria in 2016. He has many close friends among veteran activists in these countries. In July 2009, he participated in the Viva Palestina relief convoy to Gaza, organized by British MP George Galloway. Jeff has spoken many times about the Israel-Palestine issue in schools, churches, community and peace organizations, mosques, and has appeared on local and international TV and radio. He has also published articles and op-ed pieces on U.S. policy and Middle East issues. And now to Elaine with a conversation about Palestine with Jeff Klein.
Thank you, Khinwa. And again, we have our friend, Jeff Klein. Jeff, now we would like to have you talk about Palestine. As part of your trip to Syria and Lebanon, you also went to Palestine. You go to Palestine very often and you know it intimately. So catch us up on what Palestine looks like and what's happening. What are people saying in Palestine now?
So, of course, you're right. I've been to Palestine many times in the last 12 years, and one of the reasons I keep going back is because I have friends there, and also you get a sense when you repeat visits and talk to the same people, you know, what the trajectory is. And so I would have to say the mood in Palestine now among my friends who are not connected with the Palestinian Authority, but mostly with the trade unions or other organizations, is pretty glum. You know, whatever hopes there had been around the creation of the Palestinian Authority have long since faded away. And there's not much progress politically that anyone can see. The occupation regime is looking more and more permanent. And ironically, now that, you know, the Israelis have calibrated the occupation, you know, they sort of loosen it, tighten it, and they've been experimenting with allowing more freedom of movement within the occupied territories, which ironically allows the Palestinians to move around and notice that there are more and more Israeli settlements all over the West Bank. I mean, if you go from Ramallah to Nablus, every hilltop on either side of the road has an Israeli settlement on it. So it's coming home to a lot of Palestinians that their hopes for an end to the occupation are fading away.
There are basically two types of resistance that they have been following. And as things have become worse in the territories, we've seen this sort of individual intifada, if you would like, the stabbings, and then more recently was the shooting in Tel Aviv, apparently by two West Bank Palestinians. And they seem to be acts of just frustration, anger.
Right. Yeah, I agree.
I want you to hurt as much as I hurt. And the second, of course, is BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanctions, which has had some success. But we know even from South Africa, it was a very important instrument, but it wasn't what ultimately caused the regime to change there. But it was a very important contributor and more effective perhaps than people realize. So we have the BDS, and people saying that it has had some effect, especially growing in the US. And yet we've had a double reaction from the Netanyahu government, who is either using BDS to hide other problems and focusing on that, or is really worried about BDS. And so they have activated their people in the states to try to get anti-BDS legislation at the state level and at the federal level. And at the same time, they have been able to have a meeting right after UN, not with the UN, but after UN, that was anti-BDS for pro-Israeli workers. So there is this, these two forms of resistance. One is violent, and in a sense doesn't get you much of anywhere. And at the second end is BDS, which has some effect, but is now meeting with a backlash. And if Hillary Clinton becomes president, she vows that she will fight BDS and she will invite Netanyahu to the White House. If Trump gets in, we just don't know what he's going to do. So talk to us about these two forms of resistance, and do you see any value, not in terms of killing people, but in terms of having any kind of impact on new political thinking?
Well, I would add a third form of resistance that I think is actually the most critical one, is mass resistance within the occupied territories and within Israel as well, among Palestinian citizens. I mean, don't forget, in terms of apartheid, BDS was the external pressure on apartheid,
yes,
along with the military efforts of the ANC. But internally, what really turned the tide was making South Africa ungovernable. Yes. That is, mass action, strikes, demonstrations, and so on. And that's what I think needs to happen to really shake the current status quo, but is not happening for a variety of reasons, one of which is that the Palestinian Authority cooperates with the Israeli authorities in repressing that kind of mass resistance. Yes. And people are very aware of that, of the de facto partnership between the Palestinian Authority and the occupation regime. And although your viewers know there are here and there are determined acts of resistance
different
in villages and so on, but they tend to be isolated and localized, and there's no sort of mass uprising as happened during the first Intifada, for example.
Do you think that can happen given the structure of control that exists in the West Bank and around Gaza?
It has to happen, and
but
it will.
Can it? How?
Yes,
can
I mean, look. I mean, during apartheid South Africa, the military regime was at least as repressive as exists in the occupied territories in the West Bank. So
it's not simply repressive; it is the structure of control. The breakup of the Palestinian communities,
yes,
the checkpoints, the technology surveillance, the wall, the presence of settlements. It's a very concentrated area with a much smaller population. In South Africa, you had a majority population was black. And
but the resistance in South Africa, the most obvious resistance was in the urban areas.
Yes.
So yes, of course, there are lots of obstacles to the kind of mass uprising that's required, but I don't think any of them are absolute. What's lacking right now is that for many Palestinians, they've had this idea of committing to a peace process that was going to deliver an outcome for them. Many Palestinians in the West Bank were used to referring to the West Bank as Palestine and across the Green Line as Israel. They had this, it was very widespread, this idea that there was a process leading to some kind of liberation. And the realization that that has been a dead end, in effect, has left people demoralized, right? They haven't reconstituted the kind of mass resistance that's required in a new age. Certainly there are lots of obstacles, both security, political, and logistical to doing this. One of them, by the way, one of the obstacles is the entry into the West Bank of a whole array, a universe of non-governmental organizations that operate against politics and for which many Palestinians are now dependent for their livelihoods. Yes. Including ones who had been leaders during the first Intifada.
That's great.
And the ground rules of these NGOs is to depoliticize society. And for the time being, it's been mostly successful. I mean, Palestinian society as a whole in the big cities is pretty depoliticized.
Yes.
You know, it's calm. There's a kind of despair.
Yes.
And a sense of the lack of possibilities of resistance. But that can change. You know, that's a sort of political mood, a political moment of history that can change very quickly. We know the first Intifada sort of sprung up fairly unexpectedly and fairly suddenly. And so I think that mood can change. It will change, but when and how, we don't know.
Do you think, just to be the devil's advocate, that anything can really happen even if you had mass demonstrations without outside powers really putting the screws on Israel? And I say this because Palestine has nothing to offer the West in terms of resources, in terms of its technology and so forth. South Africa had a lot to offer. It was very different. The most important thing the Palestinians have to offer is to stop being a problem, right, so that the area itself becomes stabilized. And Palestine is and remains the core problem, primarily because it is seen as a victim of an expanding West.
Yeah.
And so it remains a problem, and it will keep the area destabilized.
No, I completely agree. I mean, Palestine doesn't have diamonds or gold.
No, and so
but it has the key to peace and stability in the Middle East, which the U.S. and its allies are very desirous of.
They're desirous of it, but they have what they seem to call a kind of toleration level of destabilized situation. If they can stabilize the destabilization, in other words, have it perform in the same way all the time rather than having new and exciting things spring up, they tolerate it. They tolerate killings, they tolerate pain, they tolerate the refugees continuing to suffer, they tolerate Israeli turning off water, they tolerate Israeli lack of proper judicial thing. They tolerate a lot. But in South Africa, there was a lot at stake, and they had a lot to offer. And Mandela ultimately, of course, agreed that he would not interfere with corporate interests in South Africa. So, the Palestinians don't have that kind of leverage, and in some ways, I just throw this out for your reaction. It has to be from outside, and it has to be not only a destabilization that becomes more and more intolerable, but somehow gets recontrolled. It has to be ultimately some sort of sense of the humanitarian combined with the political nuisance?
Well, I think that's where the political movement within the European and American countries is important. Both boycott, divestment, and sanctions, and sort of political agitation for a different policy toward the Israel-Palestine issue. And both of those things are growing in Europe and the United States.
Tell us something about some of these groups. I mean, one of the groups that I respect a lot in this country is the Jewish Voice for Peace. It has itself evolved. And perhaps, certainly in this area, has become one of the most active organizations. It's one of many, but I mean there are these growing groups. How do you see this evolving, and will there be some unity of effort between U.S. groups and, say, European groups?
I mean, one of the strengths of pro-Israel politics in the United States and Europe is the unity of the various lobbying efforts on behalf of Israel. In effect, they all work together. They take orders from Israel directly in terms of what their priorities are, and they hammer out a common program and political and legislative priorities. They speak with one voice, in effect. Whereas the movement for a different policy in the U.S. and Europe is very fragmented, often with differing approaches, differing assessments, lack of experience in some cases in sort of maneuvering through the political system. And that needs to change. We need to get better at that. We need to become the kind of anti-lobby in this country, and there's quite a ways to go for that, in my opinion. But on the positive side, the sort of unrestricted support for Israeli government and Israeli policy, the ideological and political support for that is eroding in Europe and the United States, and that increasingly the very, very overt pro-Israel politics is representing a diminishing part of our political structure, in some cases a minority. So I think there's some hope for change. I would only say that, you know, internationally, there needs to be both resistance within Palestine and international solidarity and support for that, and attempting politically to take away the support that the Israeli regime has from the U.S. especially, but from Western Europe also. So all of those things need to go together, and none of them is sufficient in and of itself. That is, you can't have a change sort of decreed from outside unless there's a strong resistance movement inside.
And to have a strong resistance movement from inside, what do you think is needed now? I mean, especially since you have a situation where many Palestinians are growing up without even understanding why they're in this condition. What is the source of their misery? How do they develop the tools of education and sophistication necessary to unite the people in dealing with and being able to address an international audience?
Well, I think the first thing is that a new generation of leadership has to assert itself and come to the forefront. A lot of the old leaders are discredited either because of their association with the Oslo process and the Palestinian Authority, or, as some of my friends are, who are still very principled, dedicated people, they're tired out. They're aging and getting tired.
Let me point out something here, and I think on leadership. It is true that the Israelis, every time there has been anyone that could be any kind of voice for the Palestinians, have killed them, except for Marwan Barghouti, who is in jail. The only one, I mean, that had any voice. Think of the three leaders that were killed in Beirut by Ehud Barak, dressed as a woman. Think of Abu Jihad, who was killed in Tunisia. think even of Assn, who was killed in '72 in Beirut with his car blown up, one of the most articulate voices of the Palestinians. Now, you can have young leadership, which they need. The problem is, if they have any kind of following, it is very easy in that fishbowl, in that magnified occupied territories, to kill them. So how do Palestinians develop leadership? Is it that they just have an education and assume that they will know what to do? How can they have political leadership?
I mean, I obviously, as a non-Palestinian outsider, I don't have the answer to that, except to say that the movement requires organization and leadership, and I'm not convinced, as difficult as the occupation regime makes it, I'm not convinced that it's an obstacle that can't be overcome. I mean, when you take the longer view, maybe there needs to be new forms of struggle that are more dispersed, less hierarchical, less centralized. I mean, by leadership, I don't only mean, some hierarchical leaders. There needs to be leadership in society, however that's formed. And I can't predict what that's going to happen. But I can say, I believe very strongly that however strong the movement of solidarity and political pressure on Israel outside, that in itself will not liberate Palestine. That without a strong internal resistance movement that puts enough pressure on the regime, on the Israeli regime from inside, as happened in South Africa, there won't be outside sanctions are never going to be powerful enough to sort of force a complete change in the Israeli regime. So I can't predict, except that right now, from the point of view of my recent visit, I would say things are at a kind of low ebb, and everyone is pretty pessimistic. But nobody, I mean, this is the other thing, as you know, that Palestinians are, as bad as things are at the moment, there are no voices for surrender. That all the Palestinians I know and meet in the occupied territories and within 1948 Israel have this vision that in the long run they will achieve liberation, that they are not giving up on their land. And I would say that's a very powerful thing. I mean, it doesn't express itself concretely in methods of resistance, but as a mentality, it's a very powerful force politically. And I would say on the other side, no matter how powerful the Israeli regime is, and no matter how powerful Israelis feel themselves militarily dominating the Palestinians, there is a worry that they don't have a long-term future. I would say, ironically, the people who are the most downtrodden are the most confident of long-term liberation, and the people who are on top now, the Israelis, are very nervous about their long-term presence in the land.
They should be, because any occupation may lead first to this outburst that you see of stabbings or shootings. That is just frustration. But there is in Palestine, and I think you're quite right when you say they're determined to stay on their land. They are determined to think in terms of the future. What I see is two things. The development that has long existed between the black communities in America and the Palestinians is now growing. It's a very powerful combination. As you probably know, there is a kind of resurgence of the vision of George Jackson, the Black Panther, who actually read this book in jail that was edited by Nasir Aruri and another fellow, Edmund Gharib, on Palestinian poetry. And it was called Enemy of the Sun. It was translated from the Arabic. And it was Palestinian poetry that energized Jackson. And there is now a exhibit that was circulating in Al-Quds University called George Jackson and the Son of Palestine. And recently there was a delegation that went from the United States of black and Palestinians who went to the West Bank. And these connections have been growing. As you know, in Ferguson, the Palestinians actually, Muhammad Ali came out for Palestinians. And before he became too corrupt, Jesse Jackson actually went to the West Bank and came out for Palestinians. So there has been there's really been a very long relationship between the black community and as there was with South Africa, which is one of the reasons why South Africans are so interested. And one of the things that the Black Panthers basically taught, we'll be talking to someone about this on Arabic Hour, is that you need to develop yourself. You have to strengthen the community. They have to have enough to eat, they have to have some education, they have to be aware of their issues. So leadership grows and resistance grows when you have a community that can think strategically and understand what their legal rights are. Hence, when you have Badil, which is a refugee organization in the West Bank, teaching the refugees their legal international rights, they can act with not only greater information, but with greater realization of how their rights have been massacred. So I don't think you'll get mass demonstrations until you get this development within the community itself. And that's hard to do when you have an occupation force that thinks of Palestinians as letting them just have enough to exist, but not to thrive. And I think Sarah's very concept of de-development is so accurate. And when you think of Gaza, I mean, Gaza has been so isolated and so driven. And of course, you know, Gaza has always been a thorn in the Israeli side. Most people don't realize that after '48, Ben-Gurion wanted the Egyptians to take the refugees that went to Gaza. They even almost threatened to reopen the '48 war with Egypt. They have never wanted Gaza with so many Palestinian refugees in it. So, but this constant, from above, there's this constant pressure to squeeze the people, separate them, deprive them of development, and at the bottom, there is resistance in terms of wanting to stay and also looking to a future, but there needs to be first a kind of self-development.
Yeah.
How do you feel about that?
I agree completely. That, and again, that's not something you can map out from outside. It's something that has to grow organically within their society, and I don't think we can predict now exactly what forms that's going to take, except that you know, the basic point is that the Palestinians are not willing to surrender, and that in the long run they will find methods of resistance that are effective. That's what happens in colonial societies. And you know, the French were in Algeria for 130 years, and the English were in Ireland for centuries. And the fundamental issue is, as long as a people is not willing to acquiesce to their colonial exploitation, in the long run they'll find the means to resist.
I think that's true in general, but I don't think that the Israelis took all this trouble to get the exact territory that they wanted, including now the Golan Heights, and with the water, and control the water, and throw out so many people, and control so many people, and devastate so many people on a regular basis, in order to reverse that action.
Well, I don't think the Israelis will voluntarily reverse
No.
any action that they are taking.
No, so-
but that
so-
doesn't mean that they won't be compelled to
Well,
do what
that's the
needs to be done.
problem. The problem is in the compelling. And that has to be when the world gets sick and tired of Israel. One of the reasons, at least I'd like you to react to this, one of the reasons why Israel does not want this Iran agreement, the major reason is it wants Iran as an enemy because it justifies its position with the U.S. as quote unquote a strategic asset. Now look at what's happened in the first Gulf War. Israel was asked to stay out of it because they wanted the Arabs involved. In the second Gulf War, while Israel played a technological and base point, it was kept out of the war. In Iran, Obama really stuck his neck out to get this Iranian agreement because it's good for the world. And the Israelis did everything they could to jeopardize it. And it's the first time that you could see them overcome. Actually, it's the second time. Reagan wanted the radar planes to Saudi Arabia and did get them in against the wishes of AIPAC. So, here you have this Iranian thing, and Netanyahu is still furious about it. And Hillary Clinton is saying she will monitor it very carefully. She's not saying she would destroy it. Trump is saying he would get rid of it the first day. With Israel's influence or role, I would not say influence, but her role diminishing, there is a hysteria. And it's this kind of hysteria that you see among Netanyahu and appointing Lieberman and so forth, that is also a factor in stimulating an international community to want to act. I think it is important for Palestinians internally to be strengthening themselves and to educate themselves and know their rights. I'm not sure about massive demonstrations because a lot of people would get killed and may not lead to action. It is this constant corrosion of the Israeli position that becomes a more important factor, and as it becomes hysterical, any settler state that is losing its power becomes hysterical and overkills. This is when the world begins to take notice, because the Palestinians really have nothing to offer the world. So I think it is important for them to steel themselves. Their resistance is in not giving up. Can they do mass demonstrations? Well, yes, if they see the world responding to the hysteria that Netanyahu is bringing upon the Israeli people.
Well,
I mean, they will demonstrate when they think the world is going to support them.
Well, it's kind of a chicken or egg question. I think both need to happen. I am encouraged that the sort of blind support for Israel among the political societies in Europe and America is diminishing. And it's becoming more polarized as an issue. In the United States, the Israel lobby, especially AIPAC, the American Israel main lobby organization, has always prided itself on being strictly bipartisan. That is, Israel was not a partisan issue.
And now it isn't.
Now, for a variety of reasons, including the extremism of the Israeli government, it's becoming polarized as a partisan issue, where the Republican Party is becoming the pro-Israel party, and the Democratic Party, at least at the base, is becoming much, much less so. Because of the sort of hierarchical nature of the party and money in the party, that hasn't had much expression at the top among elected officials and leaders of the Democratic Party. But I think it's inevitable that it will.
I think as things are happening, it's, it'll probably not be in my lifetime, but it's happening. Let me ask one sort of final question, then ask you if you would like to say anything further. The French tried to produce a conference on June 3rd. They had 29 states and the UN attend. Kerry, it was reported, did not favor, which means, as Secretary of State, the U.S. does not favor the conference, because the conference was talking about their coming to a solution, and the implication was that it would impose it on Israel. And of course, it was some sort of two-state solution, because that's where they're stuck. That's, to use the words of Chomsky, it's an international consensus for a two-state solution. So Kerry's statement was basically that you can't impose unilaterally a solution, that the two parties have to come to this agreement. So they're back into this notion of negotiations. Is this just simply a lame duck government, which, when it came into office, said it wanted to solve the Palestinian question? Is it now just sort of trying to hold where they were to let the next administration do what it wants? Or is this a continuing policy of the United States, in that it's not willing to explore and use something like a French conference to try to move ahead?
I mean, my impression was that the State Department's attitude to the Paris conference was ambivalent, and that they didn't dismiss it entirely.
No, they went, but they basically...
So there is talk, again, it's hard to credit how serious it is, but there is talk of possible changes in the U.S. Action in the United Nations with regard to always defending Israel from any resolution that lays down the parameters for a settlement. It's hard to know. It's still, from the point of view of most U.S. politicians, it's still a dangerous issue politically in the United States. I think it's the bark is much worse than its bite, frankly, and Bernie Sanders is sort of demonstrating that a little bit. But the conventional wisdom is that if you're running for office, you don't want to get on the wrong side of the pro-Israel people in the United States. Now Obama's not running for office again, so there is the possibility, particularly after the November election, that maybe some action, he doesn't leave office until the second half of January. So we don't know. The one thing that we do know for sure is that the Israeli policy of every government since 1967, since 1948, has been not to allow a real sovereign Palestinian state on any part of what's regarded as the land of Israel. And what changed with Oslo is that some forces within Israel were willing to talk about the possibility of a Palestinian state, but if you look at the actual policies, there has been consistent refusal to make any compromise about that, and that's not just the current radical rightist government.
No, it's been labor and the coup.
So whatever happens, it's not, the Israeli government is not going to retreat from a position of sovereignty over the whole of Palestine without pressure, both internal and external. And what form that's going to take, I don't know, except the basis for this very powerful support of Israel, right or wrong, is eroding politically in the United States and outside. And I'm pretty confident that that is going to change. Now, it's going to take a long time for that to be visible. But sometimes when there's been a political ferment, you don't see anything on the surface for a long time, and then very quickly it develops. And I think the Israelis are quite afraid of this development. And the anti-BDS, I don't think it's so much that they're fearful of BDS having a powerful effect in the United States. They want to change the subject, basically. That's my view. I don't think they're fearful that this is going to change everything. But it's in their interest to talk about that rather than talk about colonization and settlements.
Right. And if things do begin to change, as you say, it's there's change going on in the Democratic Party and so forth. Where is it changing to?
Well, it's hard to know, right? I mean, do we expect any constellation of politics in the United States to sort of overthrow Israeli policy? I doubt it. But if we have a policy in the United States that treats Israel like any other country, with which we disagree sometimes, agree, and that we don't have to finance or defend in an international arena, that would be a very powerful change, frankly. And I think that would be a message to the Israeli government that they had to look for other solutions. They had to look for real solutions to their problem. How that's going to come about, I don't know, but I'm pretty confident that it's going to.
Well, you see, from my point of view, what is really difficult is that any solution now, given that I think most people agree a two-state solution is out of the question, even though people are still trying to move in that direction, is the question of what does it mean for Palestinians? Will they have equal rights? Will there be done anything for the refugees? If so, then Israel is not the Israel that the Zionists wanted. It would de-Zionize Israel. And there is the issue. If it de-Zionizes Israel, and you have equal rights between Palestinians and Israelis, which is the
and
essence.
Jewish Israelis.
Yeah, I mean the Jewish Israelis. Then that becomes even more fierce pressure for Israel to react in a very violent way towards Palestinians.
Well, it's a danger. It's definitely a danger. Or it may seek to start a regional war as a way of maintaining its regime, essentially. So, it's very hard to predict, except that, like many of my Palestinian friends, I mean, I'm confident that colonialism doesn't have an indefinite future, and neither in Algeria, nor in Ireland, nor in Palestine. And
but it did in the United States and Australia and Canada.
Well, fortunately for the Palestinians, at least in the 20th century so far, outright genocide is not allowable in the international regime.
But as Ilan Pape said, he believes what's going on in the West Bank and Gaza is sort of slow-paced genocide.
Well, I guess that's what the future is going to have to tell. I'm more optimistic.
I don't know. I mean,
that.
this was
I'm more optimistic than that, and that where settler colonialism has succeeded in establishing itself in the long run has had to do with a very powerful demographic imbalance, whereas the colonialists were demographically much, much more powerful than the Aboriginal inhabitants, either in North America, Canada, Australia. And the Palestinians are numerous, and they're not going away. They're not going to be the Red Indians of the 21st century.
Well, I thank you for your thoughts on this, and I'm just wondering if there's anything further you would like to say to the audience about Palestine.
Well, we've talked a little bit about the United States and our history, and I would say for Americans to come to grips with what we're supporting in Palestine requires that we come to grips with our own history, and because we are in our origins a settler colonial state as well, and that part of addressing what's happening in Palestine will be much aided by looking at our own history without the blinkers of kind of the fake history that a lot of us learn in school, and that we committed genocide in our country, both against the native population and against the Africans that were imported, and yet there's only one Holocaust museum in Washington, D.C. about a Holocaust that was committed in Europe against the Jews. And when we have two other Holocaust museums in Washington, that'll go for Africans and Native Americans, that'll go a long way to
Yes.
orienting us to understand that genocide is not allowable.
Yes. Jeff, thank you very much for being with us and for expressing your really informed opinions and analysis of these issues. Come again.
Thank you.
You are watching The Arabic Hour, a program of news, views, culture, cuisine, and the Arab American experience. To view today's program or any previous programs, log on to our website at www.arabichour.org.
That's all the time that we have for today. Thank you so much for joining us. On behalf of all of the volunteer staff here at the Arabic Hour, this is Ghinwa Hakim wishing you a pleasant week and a great summer.
The Arabic Hour has been brought to you in part by the William G. Abdalah Memorial Library, a resource center for information and education on the Arab American experience, the American Arabic Benevolent Association, AABA, an umbrella association for community endeavors, the Nicholas G. Beram Veterans Association and Ladies Auxiliary, providing veteran services, scholarships with community pride, and by our members as well as contributions from viewers like you.